Hello and welcome to the Aural Apothecary Podcast, authentic chat about medicines, pharmacy and healthcare in the UK.
Pharmacists Jamie, Gimmo and STC take on topical and controversial stories but keep it edgy yet light-hearted.
Pod guests share their career-defining drug, song and book and also share their joyful patient stories.
Welcome to the Aural Apothecary Podcast. It's Series 7. My name is Jamie Hayes. For this episode, we're joined by Brian Finney and Dr. Sam Finnican. Brian is a former chartered civil engineer and now a patient, author, advocate and commentator. And Sam is a general practitioner and academic at the Institute of Applied Health Research in the Murray Learning Centre at the University of Birmingham. Both are active members of the Royal College of GPs Overdiagnosis Group, and both are authors of a fairly recent paper in the British Medical Journal titled Statins, Risk and Personalised Care. They may get to share their desert island drug for our formulary, their career anthem and a book for our library. But first, let me welcome my two fellow apothecaries. STC is in Bournemouth and Gimmo is in Cardiff. Welcome both.
Welcome, good evening.
Evening.
I would say it's been a while, Jamie, but I saw you this afternoon, didn't I? We were at the Royal Pharmaceutical Society in Wales conference, so that was good. Lots of stuff there. But yeah, how you been, Steve? Good summer?
Yeah, very good. But of course, the key question for all of us, including our listeners, is the NHS broken?
A bit broken.
I think it's on life support, isn't it? Isn't that what the report said? I suppose that's where we're headed, isn't it? I thought that the Starmer's line, which we need to fix the plumbing before we turn the taps on. We need to fix the plumbing before we turn the taps on. So I don't know whether we're going to see that level of investment, but clearly one of the things that we should note at this point, isn't it, is you might remember Professor Neil Maskery, who came on episode 5.10. Well, if you want to think about how to fix the NHS, he's written a book called Rebalancing Medicine, which he talked about when he came on as a guest. And I know that we've all read it, and so we would recommend it highly, wouldn't we, to our listeners? It's available on Amazon Kindle, and I'm not sure if it's in paperback, but you can download it through Kindle.
You can buy it on Amazon.
Medical schools, pharmacy schools and nursing schools should be ordering it in bulk.
Yeah.
And some other news, we have a professor amongst us, do we? Jamie? We do. Congratulations, Professor Hayes.
Thank you very much. That happened in the summer.
So are you a visiting professor of Cardiff Met University, is that right?
Honorary professor in the psychology department in Cardiff Met.
Wow.
Very good.
Okay, let's welcome Sam and Brian. Look, the leader for their article says, Sam and colleagues argue that guidelines should focus less on population-level risk thresholds and more on shared decision-making, conversations based on individualised risk and patient preferences. Welcome to the podcast, both. Let's come to you first, Sam, to say hello. Welcome.
Good evening. Hi, thanks for inviting me along, and yeah, great to be here to talk to you about this.
Very good. And Brian, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for the invite. It's welcome for the patient to get a platform.
Indeed, thank you, Brian. And so we're going to try something different for this episode, gents. What have we called it, Steve?
Well, we like alliteration on the Aural Apothecary, so we're going for Aural Apothecary Analyses. So we're going to take a particular paper or issue and go into it in a bit more depth. And so on occasion, we'll try and go for two guests. And where possible, we'll try and get the author of the paper. So this is our first effort. And given that we're obviously always talking about personalised care and shared decision making, and we thought that this would fit in beautifully as the first one that we did. And following on from Mary Carmen's episode in the last series about risk, and I think the takeaway message that I took from her was risk is a feeling, isn't it? And her talking about that she knew that she shouldn't worry about flying because the risk of dying in an aeroplane statistically was incredibly small, but that's what bothered her. Whereas she was not bothered by the much more likely that she would have serious complications or early death due to diabetes. And I think that was the takeaway message, as well as perhaps that as clinicians we need to do better at explaining to patients. So we thought this would be a great starter for 10. Jamie and I are very privileged to be on the Royal College of General Practitioners Overdiagnosis Group and contribute sometimes. And so we know both Brian and Sam from that. And where better to start than talking about statins when I checked the data. I think we might have mentioned this before, but 22-23, how many million items do you think there were for atorvastatin in England? It was the number one.
I was going to say, wasn't it number one in our Christmas quiz or something?
How many million items do you think of atorvastatin were issued in 22-23?
Well, in our paper, we say there's 82 million prescriptions in total for 12 months, and most of them are going to be statins. So I'm going to go 70 million.
Not bad. Yeah, it was 60. So yeah, pretty good. Very good. Yeah, most of that was atorvastatin. So yeah, so we thought statins was a good place to start, but I'm sure as we'll get into discussion, it is not necessarily always about statins, but this paper is very much specifically about what is a very common intervention, isn't it, or a very common discussion. And I'll hand over to you guys, perhaps, if you want to explain it. And one last thing I should say is that there are two other authors, aren't there, on this? And one of them has been on the Aural Apothecary as well, Professor James McCormack from Canada, who's a pharmacist, and Rani Khatib, who's a consultant pharmacist in cardiology from Leeds, I believe.
That's right. Yeah, it was great to work with James. You know how he thinks, he's a brilliant thinker, and Rani really is an expert in the prevention of cardiovascular disease from a pharmacology point of view. And obviously having Brian on the authorship team, giving the patient voice was really important. Shall I tell you a little bit about kind of the genesis of the paper?
Yeah,
Because
please.
I've been interested in statins for far too long and far too interested, really. But the reason I'm interested is not because I care a huge amount about lipids and how to reduce them, but it's really a vehicle for thinking about decision making, because we know so much about this medicine and it's really common, as you already pointed out. So we really should be getting this right. But I still think we probably aren't, which I think is intriguing from an academic point of view and a clinical point of view. But when the draft guidelines came out in early last year, there was a bit of a furore, as there tends to be when these things come out, because there was a new line in there that said that clinicians could offer statins to people if their Q risk was less than 10%, if the patient wanted it, or if the Q risk wasn't, adequately taken into account their risks. And I thought, well, what a strange thing to put in a guideline, because essentially isn't that saying that's what clinicians should be doing anyway? Why do you have to write in a guideline, be a good clinician? And it got me thinking about all this and the furore that came around. And I wrote an angry little blog and sent it to Brian to see if he'd help me with it. And it ended up several months later in this BMJ article.
So it started life as an angry blog.
Well, what would you say, Brian? Because do you remember that the first time I emailed you about it?
Yeah, it's. I'm a minimalist, so I would. I don't want any drugs. So if I'm going to take a drug, it really has got to appear to me to be worthwhile. And when you look at statins, when the number needed to treat is 30, that really doesn't meet my criteria. So that's gone. Since we wrote the paper, my thinking has progressed slightly.
Ooh.
I got a text from primary care saying you're invited for a flu jab, and I'm thinking, why can't that be the same for statins? Because there's no I'm not a fan of shared decision making, but there's no shared decision making in the flu jab. So why can't we have the same things for statins? So once you trigger the right figure, the right risk level, they just send a text out, and you watch a video, and if you need further help, you can go. But it would take some workload off the GP, and I wouldn't have to say no, thank you politely.
So Brian, just to be clear, you're not saying that everyone should get a message saying come for your statin, here's the prescription. You're saying what you'd like is what we would call pre-consultation. So you get sent the information, the best information that we have available to us. And just for the non-health professional listener, when Brian says number needed to treat, he means we have to treat 30 people with that statin for one person to be prevented from having a heart attack or a stroke. So are you saying that it's all about pre-consultation so that you then have the choice as to whether you want to or not? Or yes. Are you actually saying, yeah, I thought that's what you were saying.
That's precisely what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's like the flu jab. You are invited to make an appointment.
If you wish.
If you wish, or to say you'll have the statins or whatever.
If I'm hearing you right, it's a form of screening, that, isn't it? And the invite for the flu jab sort of almost primes you for the fact that you need a flu jab, whereas with statins it's not quite as clear cut. So I'd worry about that in terms of the bias that might introduce into any conversation that comes from it. And I guess it's how you'd identify all of the people in your practice who might be eligible for a statin.
The way to identify, I think, is Q risk. And then the system is automatic.
Sam, can you just explain again for people what Q risk involves, just so that we're absolutely clear?
Yeah, so Q risk is an algorithm that's actually built into our IT systems in primary care that takes people's risk factors, their age, gender, whether they have diabetes, hypertension, smoking history, and churns it all up and comes up with an estimation of someone's risk of having a heart attack or stroke over the next 10 years. And it really is just an estimate, but it's not a bad estimate, and it's what we base discussions, or what we should base our discussions on prevention of cardiovascular disease, not just statins, but also obviously hypertension and things like that. And it's really well embedded now, I think, in what we do. But whether we use it as well as we could or not, I don't know. But actually, what Brian suggested, Brian and I don't always agree on everything, which is why it's great working with him. But it's almost like he's read my mind on my next research project, because I think this is right. I think this is the future. What we've shown in our research over the years is actually that we're not very good at this. We're not helping people make decisions. The NHS health check program, which invites people every 5 years over the age of 40 to come and have a cardiovascular risk assessment, is a really crude tool and isn't targeted. But what we could do is we could use the data we've got on our systems to send much more targeted information about cardiovascular risk. And it could be a video, it could be an interactive decision support tool, and then give people the option. Here's what would happen if you had a statin. Do you want to talk to your doctor about it? But also, here's what will happen if you have a Mediterranean diet. Exercise more, stop smoking, and really help and pump. And it's pre-consultation. It's not replacing a consultation, but what it's doing is it's preparing people to have that consultation from the perspective of risks and benefits and options, which is what shared decision making is all about.
I'm not seeing it as a pre-consultation. I'm seeing it as an alternative to consultation, because if you look at the consultation, there's a power imbalance. And also the healthcare professional will have biases because they're human. And myself and Sam and Margaret McCartney and others produced Our Health, Our Knowledge, which is like a course, very short course, but that's available on the internet still. And that looks at biases. Now, if you do this digital approach, you remove all those biases. Because I think with some people, if the GP gives them a funny look, they'll take statins. Whereas if they don't have the GP sat across the table from them, they'll make a better choice for them.
Yeah. So it's this idea of, it's not about the clinician persuading the person of the clinician's view, which, sorry to go back to the Mary Carmen episode, but she's very clear on that, wasn't she? And in relation to, that's sometimes the problem in trying to teach clinicians, is that they think they already know the answer. And that really would help attend to this. And talking about, like you just said, Sam, about if it was interactive. So if we talk about James McCormack from Canada, for example, his and others, but his Canadian link to their peer, it's called, isn't it, peer guide, it does exactly that, doesn't it? And you get lovely smiley faces, but you could use the slide rule that says, well, if I stop smoking, then the number of bad smiley faces changes and number of good smiley faces. And if I go to Mediterranean diet rather than taking a statin, and that actually is a more nuanced way of doing it, I think, in relation to the way that Brian is suggesting, isn't it? So that you can do it online. And you talked about crude. Let me make it even cruder. I've just turned 54, so I've just received my letter today about them. I need to do my poo test. And actually, it's quite a long paper, but it's going through, before it even arrives, what I might want to consider, why the screening is and whether I want to take part. So it's kind of the same thing, isn't it?
Well, that's interesting, though, isn't it? Because you don't get that kind of advice when you go for your NHS health check, because it's not considered screening. But it is exactly the same. People don't tell you, well, if you go age 40 and your cholesterol's 7, well, no one's going to do anything about that, but your life insurance will go up. You're not told that, are you? When you go for your, that's why I didn't go for mine. Don't
yeah, me too.
But we're also, it's the wrong people are going for screening. I think we know that when it comes to cardiovascular screening, we're not reaching people who perhaps we could be working hard to reach. And so thinking about things differently, I think is an excellent idea. And yeah, the thing about debiasing is really important as well. And that's how I look at shared decision making, because if it's done in its purest form, although I get what Brian's saying about the power imbalance, it's a debiasing process, because you have to present the options and the risks and benefits in a unemotional and informative way, whereas if you just have a conversation without that, you end up getting what the doctor thinks you should get, essentially.
And that's the risk, isn't it? Is if this was something that was introduced, we do know, and Mary Clement sort of said it, and the papers we've got sort of say it, that we aren't very good at those shared decision making. So it's almost like chicken and egg. Do we do it? But if we know that most doctors and clinicians aren't good at shared decision making, we're putting in place a bad process, aren't we? So it's difficult. It would be a difficult one to pull off. That was my point about the flu vaccine. I think it's a much clearer conversation to be had about flu vaccines, isn't there, than there would be with statins.
Let me take you back, Brian, as well, because you mentioned the number needed to treat of 30, and from your messages that we see on the overdiagnosis group, you're very clear about where the benefits outweigh the harms for you, aren't you? You say you're saying an NNT isn't good enough for you for that intervention. When I run my public workshops and I ask the audience, do our medicines work? That then unravels into about a half an hour discussion about the definition of what works, and patients are talking a different language to the rest of us.
Yeah.
We're talking in NNTs where we tolerate NNTs of 30, 50, 70, 100 sometimes for these things in the future, whereas the patients are talking about things in everyday life that work. When I start to hint, well, actually, maybe our medicines aren't as effective as you might be led to believe, there's a shock in the room. There's a shock in the room. So am I right? That's what you're saying with your NNT of 30?
Yeah. That's precisely right, because what the Q-RIX doesn't take into account is family history. Now, everybody, and that includes grandparents of mine, have had cancer and died from cancer. So I would argue that, generally speaking, that's where I'm going to be going. And there's a risk, there's 200 and odd cancers, and there's a risk for every one of them. But all you're doing with this statin is looking at one single risk in isolation. And and when you talk about a 3% risk, turn that on its head, there's a 97% chance of not getting it. And which horse would you put your money on?
Yeah. And that's the values and preferences, isn't it? And really takes me back again to the Mary Carmen, risk is a feeling. You've just articulated that, in that what you're worried about is cancer, because you think that that's what your number's on.
Yeah.
What's critical to all these discussions, though, is an awareness of the benefits of the medicines that people are being given, and as Julian Treadwell's work has shown, it's really limited. And so when you get your flu jab, I'd love it if you walked into see the nurse and asked, well, what's the benefit to me of having this flu jab? And they'll be flummoxed, because they won't be able to put any numbers on it. They won't be able. They'll say, "Oh, it reduces your chances of hospitalisation and going to critical care because of flu," and that might be true, but how much? And how can you make a decision based on vague, hand-wavy risks? And that's the difficult thing, and that's where decision support tools and good quality information, I think, are beneficial. But as I think it was Guillermo said, we're still a long way away from this, because actually, even with statins, where I can tell you very well what the benefit is of medicine, and this is why it's so interesting, because we know the relative risk reduction and we know the baseline risk, which are the two things you need to be able to give someone a personalized absolute risk. And yet still, I think people don't get told that number that helps them make their decision. And for Brian, a 3% decrease in cardiovascular risk at this point may not be enough for him to take a medicine, but maybe if it was at 20%, it might be. And that's why it's important we start talking about it for the people who want to talk about it like that.
I saw a person the other day, right, and he was around 60. his Q risk was about 10, so somewhere between 8 and 12, and I gave him normal spiel. And I always say, because we didn't have time to do pre-consultation, so here's the information, I'll send you the nice decision aid, you can have a think about it, there's no urgency to this. Gave him the normal spiel, and he was like, well, I don't think I'll bother, it's not really that much of a reduction. And then just recently, I don't know if this is wrong now when I say this, but it was pointed out to me that really, when you think about it, I often say it's about reducing your risk of heart attack and stroke, but really vascular dementia is kind of the same animal, isn't it? And as soon as I mentioned that word, he said to me, well, that's it, I'll take it then. I've just buried my mother because of vascular dementia. And I don't know if you do that, Sam, but it is the same animal, isn't it? And I think it's sort of a slight, maybe it's I know that in the evidence base it wasn't exactly asked like that, but it is the same animal, isn't it? Vascular dementia in relation to heart attacks and strokes, or not?
Well, I think you're not straying too far away from fact and evidence there, but I think that it's weaker. But actually, what you highlight is this power we have, as Brian talks about, to actually manipulate decision making. I'm not saying you've done it in an evil dictatorial kind of way, but people are motivated by different things, and so sometimes I'll be talking to a younger person about their hypertension, and I'll mention erectile dysfunction when I might not mention it to someone else because it might be something that's more relevant to them, and so that's why it's important that all of this is done on a baseline of a knowledge and an understanding and a trusting relationship. And that's why continuity of care and primary care is so important for these kind of conversations.
Those conversations are dynamic as well, aren't they? The conversation you have today with somebody can be a completely different, based on what happens in the context of their life, loved ones, neighbours, can completely change their risk view, can't it? And the same conversation can end up in a very different result. Is that correct, Sam?
Yeah, well, it's very similar to what Steve said there. I had a conversation last week with a person who, as soon as I mentioned stroke, they're like, oh, my brother-in-law had a stroke and he's severely disabled. I really don't want that for me. And it wasn't about numbers then, it's about emotion. And this is the other thing that is really important when we talk about decision making is, and it might come up later, is that we're not rational, right? We talk about all this, and there's a line in the paper where I allude to the fact that we're oversimplifying things here, but we're not rational. We're all emotional. And so these things are a little bit moot sometimes when it comes to actual decision making.
A number of points. I think what we need to do is move away from percentages to what's called natural frequencies, because people, 1 in 17, 1 in 30, I suppose, but people can imagine that better. I do think people's experience and near time experience distorts the decision making, because I used to go on a men's forum for woodworking, and if some relation had got prostate cancer, he was recommending everybody was screening, which is not a good thing. And it's the same when a celebrity gets something. And now I feel sure that will be a peak, and it will tail off in time. So I think the time the decision is made is critical.
And that's it, isn't it? It's a sort of almost like an acceptance that we'll never quite get this right, because it is based on, a lot of it is based on feeling, isn't it? It's my dad died last year from a hemorrhagic stroke, and I found myself viewing everything through the lens of that, even in conversations about diabetes and other things, is, you find yourself thinking about that. But what we do know, isn't it, is that in general, we tend to overestimate benefit and underestimate risk. And I think, if to simplify it, it's coming at it from that angle and recognizing that in ourselves, and that patients are probably doing the same. It's about improving our skills as clinicians is the main starting point, but not getting too hung up, because this is what we tend to do. We start then talking about percentages and numbers and stuff, and maybe it's not that complicated.
Right.
A point we make in the paper is about harms of medication.
Yeah.
Because we've talked a lot about benefits, but we also have to think about the harms. And when you start talking about numbers, you can then compare them a little bit, can't you? You can say, well, your risk reduction is this, but the risk of harm is this. And you, again, as Brian pointed out, you should use natural frequencies because they're easier to compare. But the thing about harms is we talk about side effects and and pharmacological harms often. But the point that we made in the paper is that harms go beyond that. There's a lovely paper, I forget who wrote it, about the disutility of an idealized medicine. And so a medicine with zero side effects still has some harm to that person. And we talk about changing self-identity, the hassle of getting your medicine, testing, seeing the doctor every year and things like that. And that's the disutility, the cost to that person above and beyond side effects. And that's the thing that's highly personal, because for some people that's not important to them. But for other people, going from a person to a patient is a big step. And that's maybe an insult to their identity. And that kind of thing's very intangible and very personal. And so bringing that into the consultation as well is a skill, but it's important.
Sam, I think this is the paper you're thinking about, and it's not because I'm brilliant and I've just thought of it. I had prepared for this, as we always prepare, because, it's not just thrown together. But I think you're talking about this study that they did in London. It was actually the National Heart and Lung Institute, the Imperial in London. It's fascinating. And in our polypharmacy action learning set, Zoe Girdis, who's one of the original 5 of us that put it together, she does this brilliantly with all the GPs and clinical pharmacists that come on the session. And she actually asks them about this. So they asked 360 random strangers in public places in London. This was in 2010. And they said to them, we're offering you an ideal tablet. It's got no cost. There's no prescriptions. There's no medical supervision. There's no follow-up blood test. There's no side effects. In other words, like you said, the word disutility is just the inconvenience of taking it. And they asked them how much additional life between days and months would they want to be prepared to take it for the rest of their life. And it ranged from 1 day to more than 10 years, with an interquartile range of 1 to 36 months. But the median was 6 months, for them to actually to take it. And we do it on the call. And I'm sure that when we're talking to clinicians, they want even more benefit before they are actually prepared to take it themselves. And that's even just the inconvenience of taking it. And the conclusion, and we'll put it in the show notes, but the conclusion of that paper is that it is likely that guidelines assume what they call near zero disutility, but that isn't actually probably the case, because people are already saying we wouldn't take it anyway, even if it didn't have any side effects and it didn't require any follow-up. So it's quite fascinating, isn't it? And another reason why you need to have skilled conversation, and why perhaps you need to have pre-consultation, as we've just discussed, to give you the time to then spend in the limited consultation talking about what people think, as opposed to going through the facts.
Can I go back to Paul's? They look at the height of the benefit, or the amount of benefit. I actually look at it the other way around, because bear in mind I've got no symptoms with statins or others, right? If I've got a symptom, I've got backache, and I have a tablet and it eases the backache, I can see benefit. You're saying that you've got high value out of the statin, say. My view is I've got no short-term gain, and may or may not, and 97% chance I'll not have a long-term gain either. So I look at it precisely the other way around. What are the side effects? What's the downside?
Yeah.
And I think that is a symptom that you're in the professional role, and you want to be seen you want to feel that you're doing good. And the big problem, I think, is the road to hell is paved with good intention, and that's why I would just invite people: did they want a statin? You've reached the threshold. Do you want a statin? And give them a video or something.
It's another really good point, Brian. And actually, it's one I tell my patients when I'm talking about this. I say, this is not designed to make you feel better because you're not feeling unwell from this.
Yeah.
I go on to say, I'm a bit boring really, but I'll say no one has ever come in and sat in that chair and thanked me for preventing their heart attack or stroke.
Yeah.
And it's a thankless task. Yeah. But I've probably, and we, by prescribing primary prevention medicine, has probably saved more lives than any cardiologist doing revascularization. But we'll never know it, because we never realize that benefit, because we're spreading it thinner, and you can't prove a negative. But if someone gets a side effect, they will come in and tell us. So sometimes we feel like we're doing no good at all. So we do almost have to have a belief in the benefit and hope that the evidence is right, because we'll never realize what benefit we are giving to people, and people will never realize. And that's one of the main problems with preventative medicine.
So shouldn't the people have the choice, the final say?
Oh, absolutely. And people should always have the choice, but they should always, I think what I care passionately about is that people get the opportunity to have a good conversation with someone who knows their stuff and be encouraged to engage in the process and make the decision that's right for them. That's all that matters. I don't care whether someone takes a statin or not. Fundamentally, what I care about is that they've been given an unbiased, accurate measure of the evidence and helped to deliberate on that, because it's not an easy process, because these things are quite complicated.
I would agree. Can I just move on to a comparison between wealth and health? With wealth, you have a financial advisor. Now, he's got to say, if he's advising to buy these shares or put your money here, he's got to say anything that would have compromised his decision. Now, from the health side, the things that could compromise that decision are QOF, ICB targets or PCN targets, and things like that. So I think you've got to declare those if you want to remove some of the bias.
So that is your 4P model that you're hedging towards, Brian. Is that right?
It's part of, that's before the 4P model, yeah.
Okay. So Brian's 4P model for the listener is the impact of politicians, farmer, professionals and patient.
Yeah.
I'm cheating slightly because I jumped on the RCGP Overdiagnosis Journal Club that Brian and Sam and James ran, and thoroughly enjoyed the experience. I scribbled. I didn't know that we were going to be doing this, but I had scribbled notes down because I was going to put it as one of my revalidation entries, which I will be.
It's not just thrown together.
Some of the things James talked about, Sam and Brian, on that a lot of things are unknowable. That was, they're just unknowable. He said unknowable. I think, Sam, you talked about having better discussions without measuring cholesterol as well. I think
so without talking about cholesterol.
Yeah.
I think if you start talking about cholesterol, you start getting people on this track of my cholesterol is X, it should be Y, and then the thought process is, well, how else can I get my cholesterol down? And maybe I'll do that instead of taking a statin, and it all starts to get a little bit muddled. But if I think you stick to risk and think about all the ways you can reduce your risk, then it becomes a little bit more helpful in terms of thinking about statins. And the other reason we haven't talked about it yet, but it's the next thing me and Brian are working on, hopefully, is adherence. And if you start thinking, well, my cholesterol is 6 and it should be 4, and I take a statin for 6 months and all of a sudden it's 4, well, what's the next logical step that the patient says? And you've probably all seen this in practice. Well, I can stop the statin now because my cholesterol's 4. And we know that that's not how it works. And all you do then is your risk goes back up again. So I talk to patients about putting an umbrella down, it's still raining. It makes no sense. But that's what happens when you start fixating on the lipid numbers rather than thinking about what the overall aim is here. The overall aim is not to reduce your cholesterol. The overall aim is to prevent heart attacks and stroke for as long as possible.
And then the other thing that has come up, and it's become more common certainly on the email group, is and you allude to it in the paper as well, is the time needed to treat. So we've mentioned the word time several times tonight in terms of it takes time to have these conversations. Sam O'Brien, do you want to talk about the time needed to treat, your understanding of it?
Well, all these things do take time, there's no doubt about it. Doing these things well take more time than doing them badly. And it's one thing that actually I think one of our international reviewers put in, that this is all well and good when you have the resources, but in a resource poor environment, then we have to think about, well, is it really practical? Because the easiest way to manage a lot of things, lipids, hypertension, diabetes, is have a really well written protocol and people who can read. But that doesn't involve patients. And so, yes, there's no doubt that having these good quality discussions take longer than following a protocol, and that is a problem.
You see, I'm still not in favour of these discussions because of bias. And don't forget, these risks are coming from a population, and it's statistically invalid to move from the population to the individual risk. So if you're going to move that way, you've got one hell of an error bar. And is it worth considering?
And that's the other bit, isn't it? And again, go back to Neil Mashkery's book about, it's the uncertainty that we don't know. And therefore, I take your points are very valid, Brian. Sam and I work in general practice, and we know that QOF pushes people towards, offering these treatments without necessarily giving them enough information about that. I think your points are fair, but that is the reality of the part of the way that general practice gets paid in this quality outcome framework. But I think your points are fair, but it's not just the numbers and being able to explain it, isn't it? It's being able to say that, and we don't really have, we've only got this level of certainty, and there's always going to be a level of uncertainty, and that's always the hardest bit. I find it even harder with anticoagulation, for example, in people who are appear to be in a very high risk group.
I think actually you could adopt Brian's approach to this, and life would be a lot more simple. And people do advocate for this, and I don't think we should completely dismiss the idea. And if you look at the work of Nick Wald, and I spoke to him at a conference last year quite a lot, and he would say, well, you get to 50 and you're offered a polypill. Yeah, age is the biggest risk factor. Take it or leave it. If you take it, take it. If you leave it, leave it. You can always come back to the decision, but forget measuring stuff. Forget monitoring stuff. Take the polypill or not. And there's a lot to be said for that approach. It's completely different. It's not very personalized, but it does ultimately give people freedom of choice. And I'm not saying that's necessarily what we should do, but it's an interesting, almost thought experiment in this area.
It's okay if that person doesn't have any other morbidities or medicines that might be, a caution or a contraindication. And that's why you're going to need humans, aren't you, to have these discussions. So you can have AI to help with that and to do some heavy lifting, but you're still going to need that kind of personalization approach.
Well, let me tell you my approach to this. I exercise most days. I'm not in the gym or anything like that. We have almost a Mediterranean diet. I don't smoke. I do drink. No stress. Reasonable sleep. So, bluntly, I'm not prepared to do anything more, which comes back to Sam's point about taking a pill makes you a patient. So, if that's not enough, that's not enough. Death will come.
And that's why the two of you make such a great writing team as well.
And why we had you both on the Aural Apothecary Analyses first ever episode.
The Aural Apothecary is sponsored by Jamie Hayes Executive Coaching and OneLessPill.com.
Come on then, Steve, take them through their
paces.
Paces, yeah.
Shall I? Okay, right. So I know you guys are listeners to the podcast, so we can, we cut a lot of the introduction. So Brian, perhaps you'd like to go first. So there's a great pleasure of coming on the Aural Apothecary. You have to give us 3 things. You know what they are. We like to have them in the standard order, if you don't mind. So what would you like to offer as your desert island drug?
Oh, well, my daughter has type 1 diabetes, and she's had it for, 42 years now. So it's got to be insulin.
Okay, yeah, we've had some others pick it for that reason as well, but you'll be intimate with it, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, no arguments there. What about maybe either a career or a life anthem, and why?
We've got the DVD of Phantom of the Opera, the 25th anniversary at the Royal Albert Hall. And I was looking at it the other day, and it's Masquerade. It's the song, but in particular on that DVD, because it's so uplifting, all the costumes, all the colour, all the dancing. So mine is Masquerade from Phantom.
I can see the organ behind you there, Brian, as well. Thought you might give us a tune later.
Yeah. Well, it would be a carol, because that's the limit.
That'll sound great on the Aural Apothecary Spotify playlist. And
is that actually on Spotify?
It really is on Spotify. And lastly then, Brian, I'm expecting as a very, very thoughtful engineer that this is going to be impressive now. What about your book recommendation for the Aural Apothecary Library?
Well, my book recommendation is Expired, COVID, The Untold Story. And it's by Dr. Claire Craig, because I think we have a lot to learn from COVID. And right. that really brings it out.
Tell us a little bit more about that, Brian. I'm interested.
That, yeah. What's her background?
What's her background? Right. She's on YouTube.
Who isn't?
Well, true, yes. She's a pathologist.
Sam's hand went up, everybody.
TikTok, obviously, Sam is.
Yeah. She's a pathologist, but she no longer works for the NHS. And she's really gone to town on COVID. And it's the book is so comprehensive. It's not a reading book; it's a textbook. Just to briefly go on to the COVID inquiry, I think where they're missing, they're not looking at the international side of it. They're not looking at World Health Organization. They're not looking at the influence of Germany, who are the major funder of the World Health Organization, and also the funder of BioNTech, where the mRNA comes from.
Yeah, indeed.
And then you've got the American, because there's a lot going on in the Senate looking at it. So that book, it's not a reading book; it's a textbook. Well,
Yeah.
I felt it was worth buying.
So it's Expired, COVID, The Untold Story by Claire Craig. We'll put all of this in the normal places. Dr. Claire Craig.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, Brian. 3 excellent choices. Right, Sam, what would you like to give us then?
Is, I listen a lot, and so I spend time on my bike listening to this podcast thinking, what would I say given asked that question?
And then we asked you if you wanted to come
and then
on.
You asked me, and it's been great. But, okay, so I'm going to be really predictable here. So my drug is going to be atorvastatin, particularly atorvastatin.
Okay.
And that's because it started me off on this whole journey. Back in 2014, when the NICE guidelines changed from a 20% to a 10% threshold, and you'll remember the headlines, 6 million people are going to be prescribed a statin overnight. And it just got me thinking, because I knew clinically, I was just a registrar at that time, that wasn't going to happen. Nothing's going to change overnight. And so I thought, well, it'd be really interesting to look into what happened. And it just got me started on this whole path of thinking about, well, why did the threshold change? The threshold changed because atorvastatin became cheaper, not because it became more effective. And so it got me interested in health economics, in decision making, in this whole world. And I haven't looked back since then. And as I said at the beginning, I'm not that hugely interested in statins and lipids. What I'm interested in is how we make decisions with patients. And it's such a good vehicle for that. And it still remains for me something that is interesting to explore. And I'm still doing research in it. So that's why atorvastatin has been very formative in my career to date.
Excellent. Well, as you probably know, you're in eminent company because Professor Alf Collins picked it for very similar reasons.
I was going to say it was very similar reasons, wasn't it?
I was listening to it thinking,
but it's a great story because we're interested in it's about what emotionally attaches you to it, and it's great that it's inspired you. Similar for Mahindra Patel, who talked about the Leeds donut. Is that right? The Leeds donut. Yeah. Well, no, Bradford. Was it
Bradford Polo Mint?
Bradford Polo Mint.
Yeah.
Tony picked it as well?
I think he did, yes. I think Tony Avery picked it as well, didn't he?
Because I think if you read the small print of when we started the podcast, if somebody picks a drug more than 5 times, we have to draw a line.
Take it out.
Eject button.
You've got to pick a second one. It's a personal question, so you don't have to answer it, but I'd be interested to know what Q risk would it take for you to take a statin, for you to take atorvastatin? Maybe that's one to keep to yourself.
Or level of disutility.
Yeah.
Well, so just briefly on that, for me, I have a suck it and see kind of approach, because if you get no side effects from medicine, then, and your chance of side effect before taking it might be 5% or whatever, but your chances of taking it when you're taking it are either 0 or 1, right? You either get the side effect or you don't. So there is a bit of a suck it and see. Take it. If you get no side effects, you're a winner. Well, then it's just the disutility of taking a medicine every day. And so for me, I have no interest in taking it at the minute, but I would probably have quite a low threshold for taking it, because if I was one of the winners who didn't get any side effects, then I wouldn't be too worried about it. But that's my view on it.
Okay, great. And what about a career anthem or a life anthem?
So I like a lot of music, but I'm not really. I'm a bit boring when it comes to music. But I was thinking about this more recently, and I haven't had an anthem in my mind all the time. But I've decided on 3 Little Birds by Bob Marley. And the reason being, I went on a scientific expedition when I was 17, in between Lower Six and Upper Six to Lesotho. and we had a laptop. This was in the late 90s. To do the science on, but we
Laptop
bought some
in the 90s.
A laptop, I know, it was very advanced, solar panels and everything. But we took some music CDs with us to listen around the campfire in the middle of Lesotho, and we only had 5 CDs for 6 weeks, and one of them was Bob Marley's greatest hits and Three Little Birds Stuck in My Head. And now I'm lucky to have 3 little daughters of my own, so it's kind of those 3 little birds as well, and one of them's called Wren, so she's even
Cute.
Brilliant.
There you go.
Proper story.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Yeah, excellent story. And what about your book then for the Aural Apothecary Library?
Well, you might be able to guess my book as well, and unfortunately it isn't novel, but it's Thinking Fast and Slow. It really was an eye-opener for me. I had to read it really slowly because it's quite hard, but every page is fascinating. The illustrations and the stories, but the real take-home message that we are not as rational as we think is so important when you start thinking about it. As Brian said loads of times today, the biases and the heuristics, and I learned a lot about this from Neil as well, as you mentioned earlier on the show. If you pretend that humans are rational, you're missing the point. And Thinking of Fast and Slow really hammers home that we're not. And although it is hard, it is accessible. And I think anybody working in this area really, it's a Bible for them.
Yeah. And in a way, this is what we're talking about, isn't it? It's part of this shared decision-making conversation, is shifting people from that fast, emotional way of thinking into a more considered and logical choice, isn't it?
Nice segue, Gimmo. Yeah, spot on.
Not,
and so that's Daniel Kahneman, who sadly died this year, didn't he?
He did, yeah.
For the listener. But yeah, I think we are all nodding along because we've all... I've certainly got halfway through it.
It's not an easy read, is it? Some of it,
like you said, Sam, you've got to go slowly, and if you're listening on audiobooks, you need to turn it down to 0.8 or 0.7. That's a little tip that I learned recently on a podcast I was listening to.
I'm considering taking another run at it at some stage, but I've got to read Neil's book first.
Do you know the guy who wrote Moneyball? Lewis, I want to say. Michael Lewis. He did a book about Daniel Kahneman that actually explains Thinking Fast and Slow better than Thinking Fast and Slow does. The Project, that's it.
Project, because it talks.
So there you go.
Daniel Kahneman and his research mate. What's his first? I can't pronounce it properly. From Israel, isn't it? I think
and it talks about Sigorsky or something like that, isn't it? But it talks about his life in the military and how it influences thinking and stuff. It's great.
Excellent.
As are all Michael Lewis's books, actually. They're brilliant reads. Okay, a big thank you to Brian and Sam for joining us on the Aural Apothecary Analyses and for sharing their stories, their desert island drugs, their career anthems and their books for our library. Coming up next time, we'll be joined by Dr. Berwyn Owen. Berwyn is a former director of pharmacy and intriguingly recently described as the future of community pharmacy. Join us next time on the Aural Apothecary. You can contact us via Twitter at Aural Apothecary. We're on LinkedIn. You can email us at auralapothecarypod@gmail.com. Don't forget the website, www.theauralapothecary.com. Gimmo now with a final ingredient.
Okay, so thank you both. That was a great sort of conversation, and as Jamie said, that was our first time at that format, and I think it went really well. So this week's final ingredient's got nothing to do with what we've just talked about, but we've talked in the past about the need for new and innovative drugs, in particular the need for new antimicrobials. But where are these new drugs going to come from? Is it the pharmaceutical industry? Is it biotech companies? Is it artificial intelligence? Well, what if I told you the answer was gorillas? That's right, lowland gorillas from Central and West Africa. So, according to a recent article in the BBC, self-medicating gorillas may hold the clue to future drug discovery. So actually, great apes are known to self-medicate. They select plants with healing properties, and recently a Sumatran orangutan in Indonesia was seen to apply a paste from a plant to a wound on its cheek. It chewed the leaves and stem of a plant called, and I think I've got to pronounce this right, Akar kuning, which is a known anti-inflammatory and antibacterial plant, and then it applied the chewed leaves to its face. Interestingly, it reapplied it over a number of weeks and it healed. So not only do they understand antimicrobials, they understand the importance of completing the course. And in a recent study published in PLOS One, botanists selected 4 trees that are known to be eaten by western lowland gorillas. Amazingly, all 4 plants showed antibacterial activity against a multi-drug resistant strain of E. coli. So, given the vast unexplored forests that these gorillas inhabit, the potential is huge. Many of these plants remain unstudied, and so following the gorillas' lead may give us vital clues on where to focus. So there you have it. Gorillas are swinging ahead when it comes to drug discovery. We've always worried about the costs of this, but it looks like it might only cost us peanuts.
You have been listening to a 3 Apothecaries production. Sound engineer Jimbo Slough, original music Jamie Brewster, artwork by David Baker and Jacob Howard.
Thanks for listening to the Aural Apothecary podcast, where we always dispense with accuracy.
This episode of the Aural Apothecary is sponsored by onelesspill.com, a medicines optimization consultancy.